We're live.
All right. Okay. I'm gonna assume I don't need a microphone. Are we good? Or should I use the microphone?
Use the
Yeah.
microphone.
Yeah. Okay. For the video. That's probably
It's
good.
an accessibility.
Yes. Can I take this out? No.
No.
No. That's fine. Okay. How's that? Good? Okay. Thank you for being here. I'm Annie Freitas from Operation Restoration. I'm located in Louisiana, and my organization does policy work and also programming. We have a college and prison program, a reentry program. But today we're really going to talk about policy work. And before I introduce our panel and let them speak to their amazing work across the country, I just wanted to give us all kind of like a brief introduction to get us on the same page with this issue. Yesterday we had a lunch meeting, and I see some people from the lunch meeting, and I see a lot of other people that weren't in the lunch meeting, which is good too, right? Because we want to have this conversation in lots of spaces. So really what we're talking about today is the movement to remove criminal history questions from college admissions to make colleges more accessible to folks with convictions. So that's been called the Beyond the Box movement. Layla was really big in branding that with the Department of Education and at Columbia, and we'll talk about that. It's also been called the Fair Chances movement, but really what we're talking about is college accessibility and criminal convictions and how to remove those barriers. I think that, I want to say that our comments are going to be limited to really the education sphere. So when we think about Beyond the Box, of course, we think about what happened in employment, and we think about housing, and also education. And we're going to stay kind of in the education realm, even though all the wonderful work that's happened in employment and in housing is obviously informing what's happening in the policy sphere for this, but we're going to stick to education today. So the history of this movement, because I think it's really important to start with that, is really tied to the employment area and the housing area, and it goes back. People have been working on Beyond the Box initiatives for 20 years, so this or more in some cases. So this is not a new movement, but it's something that we've seen pick up a lot of steam in the past 5 years, and things that we have a lot of hope for what's coming shortly for this on the state and federal level. This also has happened a lot on campuses. Right, so we can think about like 3 levels for Beyond the Box in higher education. So we can think about what's happening on the campus level to remove these barriers, what's happening on the state level policy-wise, and what's happening and has happened on the federal level. So the representatives that we have today are from 5 different states that have attempted this policy or passed this policy in their state. So kind of course, building on this wonderful history of work in Louisiana, we were able to pull from New York and from Maryland, from other states, to pass this legislation in 2017. We were the first state to pass this piece of legislation to remove criminal history questions off of public college applications in Louisiana. We would have been second if it wasn't for Maryland getting the veto from the governor, which they then overturned this year, and I'll tell you more about. Illinois has attempted this 3 times.
Yes.
I was thinking about it. Yeah, 3 times, and we're working on that, and so Quentin will tell you about that. Layla, I probably should have started with, has been doing this in New York, and how many times is New York attempted?
I believe it's like 4 times, maybe. I might be wrong.
I think 4 times, and Noel in Washington became the 2nd state to pass it this year. And so I want them to tell you the stories of that, how that happened. I want this to be more of a conversation of how we can get more states to pass this policy, or more campuses to pass this policy, and then also how we can support, and not just support, but lead the federal efforts on this issue. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. And I just want to jump right in. So I think, starting with where we are here in this space, Noel, I want you to start with us off on kind of what brought you to this issue and your experience as it relates to this conference.
Awesome, Annie. Thank you so much for that introduction. And basically what I would like to start off
introduce yourself too. Sorry.
My name is Noel Vest. I'm a graduate student at Washington State University in Pullman in the PhD program, hopefully finishing up in May. I'm also a board member of Civil Survival, and I'm also what brought me to this conference last year was the work that I've done to found a prison reentry program at Coyote Ridge Prison. So the one thing that I definitely want to start off with is that to anyone sitting in this audience today, I was a person sitting in this audience 1 year ago today, and I was able to leave this conference, and with the help of all these incredible people up here, was able to go back to my state and start working on this and surround myself with the right people to get legislation like this passed. So this is possible for anybody in this audience in your respective state. You can leave and pass legislation like this in your state. I promise you can do that. If I can do it, anyone can. So I want to also first start off by thanking a whole lot of people, right? There's a whole lot of people that aren't here that had a lot to do with this. I usually start off with thanking everyone on this board, but I don't have to do that today because they're all right here and they know how much they've meant to me. First of all, I'd like to thank Gina Castillo because she was just incredible, and I could have never done this without her help and her research on this issue. Second, Lane Pavey, and I did the group up in Spokane, Civil Survival. Without their help, paving the way in Ban the Box for employment, we wouldn't have been able to do this in our state. I don't believe we would have been able to do this. They really paved the way for us. A couple of other people, Brian Walsh and Arlen Harris, who were both here last year, were very, very helpful in kind of navigating the legislative part of it. And then Chris Mulick at WSU was very helpful as well. So, and then lastly, I want to thank Bradley Cooper, or Bradley Custer, who did a lot of research in this area to really kind of help us along in having some research to kind of back up what we're trying to accomplish here. This bill, the bill in Washington was the epitome of a grassroots organization or a grassroots effort. Nobody had any experience with any kind of legislation whatsoever. I actually failed political science in high school, so I had no idea how any of this works. So this is kind of fly by the seat of your pants kind of a thing. There was definitely some luck involved and some fateful coincidence, and I would say that even a year ago, I knew none of the people on this panel. I'd heard of Stan Andreessen, some of the work that he was doing, but I didn't know anyone on this panel. So this was really, I think this conference, I thank Chris Beasley and the work that he's done with Formerly Incarcerated Graduates Network, because without those organizations, I would not even be here, right? I would not even have been here last year to get this stuff rolling. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about kind of the path in Washington, and if you guys have any further questions, I'm here the whole time. So if you want any definitive answers, I can definitely do that for you as well. But I'm just going to give a real brief overview. So I left here last year, basically, like I said, I sat where Chris is sitting right here, and I asked, hey, do you think that this is something that could pass in Washington State? And everybody up here kind of looked at themselves and they were like, yeah, we think this can pass in any state. So I left this conference very, very pumped up, right? Super just pumped that we could go back and get something going on this. So as soon as I got back to Pullman, I started talking with Gina, who had done a great research project on Ban the Box and a great research project on some other things as well. I had Annie send me this great file that she had on the research that was done, and then she also sent me a copy of her bill, which was super, super helpful because I could take that bill and then kind of work that into the laws of Washington State, right? Because our laws work a little bit differently. And was able to kind of find where it fit in, and then the next step was like, okay, well, what do I do now, right? Once I've kind of fashioned this bill, I had no idea where that, how does a bill get into legislation? So Annie and some other people said that, you want to start probably with your local legislators. They're going to be the best people to introduce this bill for you. And not to bore you with how the state of Washington works, but where Pullman is at is very, very conservative. I got very cold, not even lukewarm reception from the legislators in my district. But they were very helpful in telling me, hey, this person would be really, really helpful in trying to get this legislation passed. Being a poor college student, I waited until there was what we have is called Coup Day on the Capitol, where a bunch of us go out to Pullman. I waited for that day in mid-January, and I found myself in the office of Senator Saldana, and I was saying, me and these individuals from Civil Survival would really like to introduce this bill, and Senator Saldana said, absolutely, 100%, I will do this. And so within a week, it was submitted. The next thing is that it gets passed into this, because it was a Senate bill, it goes into the Higher Education Committee in the Senate. And I found out the night before that it was going to be introduced the next day. I'm 5.5 hours. This is the middle, away from Olympia. This is the middle of winter, and I have to teach at 9 o'clock the next morning. I teach psychology at the university. And so this was just not going to happen. And this is where Civil Survival really just stepped in and was incredible, because, I was able to call Tara. She arranged for Chris Beasley. She arranged for James Jackson and herself to show up that day that next morning in Olympia to testify on this bill that they felt was very, very important. And when we started this, I talked about this last year too, is that my goal really was just to start a conversation for this bill, right? I just wanted to start a conversation in our state with this. I really had little hope that this would honestly pass, and I don't say that lightly. I just say that that's kind of how legislation works. It generally doesn't happen this fast. You start a conversation, it takes a few years, people warm up to the idea, and then something will happen. So and then on top of this was a short session in our state, so it was one of those things where it just didn't have a whole lot of legs, and I didn't really see this happening. But it passed out of the Senate Higher Education Committee. Luckily, within a few weeks, it passed out of the Senate as well. And the cool thing is that we got to see, this is where Gina's research came in, because we got to see, when you watch and everyone can go back and watch and follow how long this bill, SB 6582 in Washington State, you can see the senator up there, Senator Ranker, who's the leading senator in the Higher Education Committee. You can see him on the Senate floor basically reading right off of the report that Gina had sent him. So it was really cool to kind of see how all of this kind of worked. So it passed the Senate. Then we had to go into the House. It worked a little bit smoother in the House because Drew Hansen was the higher education chair of our House committee. He was a representative that was the chair of that committee. So we got to actually kind of pick what day we wanted to introduce this legislation. So me and Gina were able to drive out and testify. Another person that was directly impacted as well drove down from Western Washington, where they actually still had the box, and he was able to testify on this as well, Steve Simmons. And it was just a great experience. I'll kind of wrap up basically by saying that this passed the House by 63 to 36 vote, and was enacted and signed by the governor of all days on my birthday of last year. So on March 15th of last year. And I will say, when I got out of prison in 2009 in Washington State, I had my dad drop me off at Columbia Basin College the day I got out, and I told him, do not come back and pick me up before I'm signed up for school, because I know this is the only pathway that I have out, and or at least I thought it was. And so I didn't have the question that asked about, but I was expecting it. And I know it seems like a small thing to people that maybe it's just another box that they don't check or whatever. But to me, I never forgot that moment. It was a very, very important day for me, and to not have to check that box and worry about having to explain myself and I don't take that lightly. And when I go back into the prisons and I talk about this legislation, or I talk across our state or whatever, it is so important to understand that removing these barriers like this it's instrumental for people coming out of prison, because they really need every opportunity to get a chance like this. So anyways, I'll leave it at that, and let these other experts kind of fill you in on what they did in their state. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Noel. I think one of the things that stood out, and I want to emphasize from Noel, is when he, after this conference, came to us, he said, "You just give me the information and I'll give it to them and they can talk about it." And we said, no, you're doing the legislation. And he said, "But why me? Like, how could I do this? I don't know how to do this." And we said, "Well, but like, who else, right? Like, who else should be doing this but you? Like, you are the one that should do this, right?" And so, and it was, because that was our story too, right? Is that we'd never done legislation before we did this in Louisiana. We showed up and we figured it out, and then we were able to help Noel figure it out. And so I hope that inspires more people in the audience to even if you don't know what a committee hearing is, like it's a process that can be taught, and you can do it as well. And who else but Stan Andrees to lead this movement in Maryland, right? Doctor, I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Dr. Stan Andrees. Yeah. So Stan, tell us about Maryland.
Yes. All right. So thank you everyone for attending, and as Noel just mentioned, we have an incredible group of folks here that are doing the work all across the country, and I'm honored, and it's a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. So before I even get into telling you about what we did in Maryland, I just want to give you a quick understanding of myself first. So I'm a formerly incarcerated person, just as the folks here joining us in leading this movement. I come from being directly impacted by the question. And so, as a formerly incarcerated person, I grew up in the St. Louis area, and started making a number of poor decisions from my very younger years. And I was by my early 20s, I was sitting in front of a judge facing 20 years to life for drug trafficking charges. And as in this early 20 phase, still very much easily mendable, and I come to find out now that the brain's not even fully developed until your later 20s, and folks who become incarcerated may be even further delayed, and males may even be further delayed. And so I'm sitting in this courtroom, and at this point in my life, I have 3 felony convictions. I have juvenile justice involvement, and this prosecutor is painting this Picasso picture of me being this career criminal. And she was successful in sentencing me as a prior and persistent career criminal, in my early 20s. And her reasoning for that was that she felt that I had no hope for changing the decisions that I had been making up until that point. And I'm now able to say, after
That's right.
Stanley Andrees, I'm a endocrinologist scientist and a professor at both Johns Hopkins and Howard University College of Medicine. So I've clearly probably changed.
I think you might have.
So that that stuck with me for a very long time.
And
And
a
actually,
new dad, sorry.
and
And
a
a
new
new
dad.
dad.
I'm sorry. That's the
Thank
big.
you.
I'm a
thank you.
little proud.
I actually, that's my. So I'll also be giving a talk tomorrow morning. That's my first slide. Thanks for stealing my thunder.
Well, it's a teaser. Like we all want to see the
So it really, that has stuck with me for a very long time. This idea of being a career criminal, and it hampers. It still is this barrier, psychological barrier for me. And I'll talk a little bit more about my experiences tomorrow, and we can definitely do as like a sidebar of those different challenges. But when I was ready to get out, I was fortunate enough to have this mentor step into my life that really started planting the seed and investing in my potential and really giving me the belief that I can pursue this journey of higher education. And so I was really pumped up and excited about throughout my time in prison, I really started believing in myself and being able to pursue higher education. And when it was time for me to leave, I applied to a number of different programs, and I was rejected from every single one. And these, I actually started applying for them while I was still incarcerated. And these, a lot of them, just due to the complications of the mail system, due to the complications of the guards, keeping things from me and just intentionally making it more difficult. These applications took, on average, like 6 months to put together, and the rejections came in almost immediately. I eventually was accepted into a program where this mentor of mine that had stepped into my life, he was on the admissions committee. And so I get into the program, and I end up completing at the top of my class. I complete my PhD and my MBA. I eventually move on to Johns Hopkins Medicine as an endocrinologist, and I'm studying diabetes. And I eventually move on to Howard University College of Medicine. And so, looking back through all of that, it was very clear to me that, the reason that I didn't get into those programs that I didn't get into is because I had to check that box. And the reason I got into the program that I got into was because I had this person advocating for me and saying that I know Stanley on a different level, than what this box is showing. So without that person, I may not even be here, right? So this was very, when I was approached in Maryland, and I didn't really know how I got into grad school and, to me, I think he sprinkled some magic and magically got me in, and I really never asked any questions about how he did it. So I was still kind of not telling folks about my past. And then, I eventually moved on, and there were some complications of getting into Hopkins. I get into Hopkins, and I still really hadn't shared yet. But I had been sharing locally to folks, to different groups not necessarily on a broader scale. And I connected, the same way with Noel. This is, I connected with a few organizations in Maryland that were like, this is, we need, we're starting the Ban the Box movement. They actually had just successfully passed it on the employment side, and they wanted my assistance on the college side of things. And at that point, I felt that it was, there was a greater good in the potential challenges it may bring to me for presenting to bring my story to light. And so when we got into working on Ban the Box and college applications, the key part of it was, the organization that we were working with was an organization called Job Opportunities Task Force. And in this process, we knew that it was very, very important that we put the folks who were directly impacted and share their stories. And so, myself and a few other formerly incarcerated folks who use education as this transformative tool in their lives, we all testified, and the bill actually passed in extremely, extremely high favor in the House and the Senate. It was a very, so Maryland, as she was just mentioning, was one of the first states to, we were the first state to present this, and a lot of our bill that we ended up putting together, and it was very, I was part of this process. A few of the other formerly incarcerated people were part of the process of actually writing the bill. I think that's a key part of what you'll see throughout all of the folks here, is that we were actually part of the process of writing it, we were part of the process of presenting it, and we stayed involved in it. But the bill, even though it passed in high favor in the House and Senate, it was eventually vetoed by Governor Larry Hogan, who is a Republican governor in Maryland who just got reelected. And his reasoning for vetoing it was that it was the colleges and universities owe it to the parents to keep the students safe. So it was this, very often used technique of fear mongering. We need to keep the criminals off of campus. And so we countered that by, one of the strategies that we used in Maryland was we countered that by going directly to the students. And so we did a number of student visits and informing the students and informing the community of, are you even aware of this question? Are you even aware of the impacts of this question? And do you want, people like myself on campus with you, sitting next to you in class? And most of them were like, I wasn't aware of this, because if you're not a directly impacted person, that question, when it comes up, it has no bearing to you. But for a person like myself, it literally, and it still does, it literally brings up this visceral fear of, this place doesn't want me. It brings me back to that courtroom in my early 20s, when I was being told that I was this dangerous threat to society. It brings me back to feeling like, I'm not accepted here. They don't want me. I can't even, I can never fit in or meet this mold of what they're looking for. And, we'll talk a little bit more about the statistics and how that, the statistics clearly show that a lot of people are feeling like that. So we had to change, we worked on the narrative around what a person who's been through incarceration, what do we look like, what is, the values, the talents, all the potential of these folks. And the students were like, why? Why wouldn't we want you on campus? Like, exactly. What is the big deal when, again, the statistics also show that there's no increased threat. This idea of this fear that was being, the statement that the governor made is just completely rooted in, it's just completely false. There's the evidence actually to the contrary. So we presented that. It was, the students, we presented it in a way that, like, even if it doesn't pass in the as a state legislation, a lot of the student organizations that we talked to put together bills to present to their leadership at their schools to try to get it removed from their schools. But we eventually were able to get together. We held some rallies and had a petition, and we made enough noise and had some media publicity around it. And it was successfully, the veto was overridden in early January, making us the second state behind Louisiana.
So, Michael, from the campus level in Maryland, what did you see? What can you add?
Yeah. So I was one of those students that Dr. Andres showed up for. And so I had been doing work on these issues for a while, and from a campus level, when this kind of movement happened and we saw this need and the governor had vetoed it, it was an opportunity to kind of push students who potentially have not had any interaction or are not directly impacted to use their voice. And so it involved some rallying, some organizing, and some push, especially from my institution, which is the flagship institution in the state of Maryland, University of Colorado, which has the most voice in terms of the educational system in the state of Maryland. And so lots of organizing and lots of student groups coming together. And I think this is an area where students do have some power and some agency to do some of this stuff. And there are student groups that care about these issues, even if they have never engaged in this conversation. So the graduate government, graduate union cares about labor. This is something that they work on, graduate students, and many of us are graduate students on this panel or have been graduate students or are working towards that. So they care about labor, and so it's a nice connection. I think that was a really good way for some of the students on college campuses to see the importance of this issue, that not having a box means more opportunity, which means better opportunities for employment, which means kind of changing this unfair and oppressive capitalistic system. Any kind of student group working on social justice initiatives saw the value in it. And so from a student voice and from a student perspective, I do think that's useful, and students have a way of having a lot of power and not having a whole lot of ramifications for their voices, which is sad, but also good in the sense that students can say stuff and rally and protest and argue and not necessarily face legal action afterwards, which is an immense privilege to wield in terms of these initiatives. And so I definitely recommend taking advantage of some of those students. And it was really exciting, I think, to hop on to a movement at this very important point of we've been knocked down, even though it had passed with near unanimous bipartisan support, to kind of hop on into that moment.
Thanks.
Oh, I didn't introduce, I'm Michael Brick. Hi,
Yeah.
doctoral student at the University of Maryland. Thanks, Layla.
Thank you, Michael. I tell the students on our campus that they are the consumers.
Yep.
And so they have all the power as the customers. And a lot of what they don't understand about the faculty is that we get paid by the university, and therefore we're beholden to them on some level, and that limits what we can do, right? Not always, but it's, and there are lots of college, not that my college was, they're like super excited about these efforts, and they like wrote articles in their newspaper about it, right? But yeah, that's definitely important. Quentin, Illinois. What happened and what is still happening in Illinois?
Thank you, Annie, and
Introduce yourself.
yes,
Introduce
yes, thank you. They got it right over there. My name is Quentin Williams. I am a project manager for an organization called Heartland Alliance on our national initiatives team of poverty and economic opportunity. I am also a doctoral student in the Department of Sociology. I, like Noel, have this really hesitancy to say when I'm actually going to be done. But I am eyeing a 2019 finish, so then I can be like Dr. Andres over here
we're
pretty
all
soon.
getting to that level.
I'm close though. I'm really close. So 2019, I'll be finished. And also, just to quickly talk about how I got involved in this particular fight, in this particular work, I have a lot of parallels to Stan's story. There was also a statistic or a thing that sort of, he says, this idea of the career criminal sort of follows him and is always on his mind. There's a particular stat that as I was going through my undergraduate education that really stuck with me, and it was that 1 in 3 Black men who drop out of high school can expect to land in prison, right? And I realized that, oh my God, it was really eye-opening, disheartening, and all sorts of other emotions to know that I had been caught up in that statistic, because I dropped out of high school I left high school when I was 15, and in many ways thought, and after a number of incarcerations, felt like my life was over. I was like, I have no education. I've been to jail multiple times. What am I going to do? And much like Stan, it took somebody to come and say, well, you're not finished yet. You have intelligence, you have, all these things. So anyway, and I kind of sparked in what was already in me, which was a love for education, which was a love for books. My mom, she still has a 3rd grade report card straight A. So I was a good student. I read melodies and stuff like that. And, just a number of different circumstances lead us on certain paths that take us down a certain journey. So anyway, left, but ended up going back, getting my GED, so very sort of non-traditional path to a PhD student and professor now. I also teach like Noel, and I had a similar experience. So I'm applying for graduate school, and I got denied multiple times. However, had it not been for an ally on the inside, on an admissions team, that I don't know if I would be here today. So I'm very thankful for Dr. Ed Flores, who's in California, who was on that admissions team and said, he told me later, I didn't even know him at the time. He just sent me an email. He said, I saw your application, come see me. And I'm like, that scared me. I'm like, what you need to see me for, right? But when I went to see him, he was like, man, I told them we have to have this guy. So I'm very grateful for that. But what that also sparked in me was like, how many people, right? I was very discouraged from all the no's. I was very discouraged. I had never thought about grad school. I mean, it was such an iterative process and sort of opening my eyes to what was actually possible. And one of the things that stops people from thinking what's possible is this question. And it haunts all of us, right? And we get that question, we see that question, and it is like a decision point for us, a major decision point. Like Stan said, like people who are not directly impacted can look over it, but that is not a question we can look at. There's all sorts of things that are embedded in that question, depending on what your specific circumstance was. That sort of is like you have a decision to make here, and it's no wonder that some people decide to opt out in. And that's thanks for the research in New York that shows this chilling effect, right? That the question actually has on people admitting or following through on an application to school. So this legislation particularly, and so that's my personal investment. Education for me was a pathway to things that I didn't even think was possible for, quote, somebody like me. And now many doors and opportunities have opened, and it has been a priority of mine to make sure that folks who with similar backgrounds as me can know that there's opportunity and pathways through education, right? I think for a lot of formerly incarcerated folks, at least from where I'm from, they don't get pushed into higher ed. They get pushed in sort of construction and jobs and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, people need jobs to be able to take care of themselves. But I always ask the young man in programs, it's like, he's like, yeah, I'm doing construction. And so I was like, is that what you like to do? And they not almost always, but a lot of times say no. I was like, well, what do you want to do? I say, man, I want a business. I want to go to college. I want to be a this and that. So I think taking that question off will help in the process. That's a longer process of showing people what's possible. So that's what I do. So now what happened, there's a legislator, and I don't know if you know about Illinois politics, but it sucks, right? There's no way, a better way to say it. It's terrible, right? So we have a lot of political barriers that I can hopefully I have a chance to speak about later. But so the reason why I say that is that the impetus for this particular bill, House Bill 3142, came about from a Republican legislator, which was amazing, right? It's really awesome. And what it came, and this is the importance of directly impacted people. She said she met with a constituent that was talking to her just in regular conversation and said that because of his record, he just didn't want to apply because of the question, that it induced some sort of something with him. And it sparked in her brain, it's like, why are we even asking in the first place? Because she knew this individual, knew that this individual was clearly capable of and had the skill set and had the appropriate credentials to get into school, but did not just because they encountered this question. So she talked to a couple of organizations, including mine at Heartland, and obviously this is something that I have personal investment in, so we got involved. This bill has passed the House two times. The first time after it passed the House with bipartisan support, both Republicans, and if you have a Republican sponsor, that's a good thing. And it passed the House the first time and then died in committee. Okay, back to the drawing board. Passed the House again, passed committee, but died in the Senate, right? And now where we stand now, it passed the House again, And our Republican sponsor is retiring, so we kind of have to do it now. And well, we won't give up, but it'll be good if we can do it now. And so what's happening now is that it hasn't been called in the Senate because we don't have the votes, right? So we didn't have the votes during our legislative session, and right now what we're doing in this month actually we're going to make a push to get the votes to get it done in veto session, which is next week. So I have action items for you all, but we'll get to that. But it's some of the pushback has been. Am I getting ahead of myself? So the reason why it's been so hard is some of the things that people have already mentioned, which is what about the parents? One. What about the safety of the students? Two. And then three, specific to Illinois, is lots of politics, right? And this bill was introduced during a budget crisis and lots of fighting between the speaker and the governor, right? So you have lots of politics driving what people can and cannot vote for. We've also run into some election cycles, right? That this bill, unfortunately, how politics works in Illinois, probably in other states, is perfect for a mailer, right? If you support this bill and you're in an election season, then it's quite likely that if you support this, somebody, and we've had Dems use mailers against Republicans saying things like they supported ex-cons or this and that and the other, right? They both do it, right, during election time because all the gloves are off, right? Values go away, I guess, in election seasons. But that has people are scared. It's not that they don't want to, but they're thinking of their careers, right? And that's just it makes me sick. But they are afraid of the mailers that may come out from supporting this bill. So one of the things that we've done, and so coming into this coalition happened because civil survival, right? I was able to, so first of all, the research that we came across in New York, but also that was conducted in New York, but then the organization that Noah mentioned, Civil Survival, we have a mutual friend, and I was like, hey, she was like, we've done this in other states and sort of arranged this really quickly, and Noah was just really on top of it, and Layla as well, just like really forming it really quickly. So they gave us a lot of insight on how they got things done. So one of the things we've had right now, we have the Yes Apply Coalition in Illinois, which recently they used, they connected with students and parents, and now we have parents and students they had this big event 2 weeks ago in front of UIC where my favorite sign was a woman was holding, said soccer moms for diversity. I was like, great, we have parents on board to push back on the myth that parents oftentimes don't even know, so you can't use parents as an excuse. And then as Stan said, there is no evidence to suggest that asking that question improves or promotes campus safety. There's no evidence whatsoever. It's all anecdotal, it's all fear-based, and it's all lies.
Thank you. Good note to end on. Yeah. So Layla, you've also experienced lots of barriers in New York, and also gotten a lot of good work done at the university level. So can you talk to us about those barriers and those wins? Kind of like where you've seen progress, and then where you've also, this legislation has kind of gotten stopped in New York?
Hi, everybody. So my name is Layla Martinez. I am the president and founder of Beyond the Box Initiative, which aims to provide supportive services to prospective and current students who have been impacted by mass incarceration. And there's several reasons why I started the organization, but I'd like to speak about one in specific, which was, two. I'll speak about two because they're both equally important. So the first one was, so I'm formerly incarcerated myself, and when I just recently graduated from Columbia University.
All right.
Thank you. And when I started the application process, I came across the question. And it knocked the wind out of me. I almost didn't finish the process. But because of friends and family on their insistence, I did answer the question. I didn't really answer it the way they wanted me to. I told them, I checked yes, and then explained who Layla was. Layla was someone who had obtained the 3.9 GPA her first semester back in school, although she was a single mom and had a bunch of other obstacles, and was in that semester taking 6 classes, doing an internship, but still a single mom. And I wound up being accepted and obtained the full scholarship as well. But once I was there, about 2-3 weeks after my very first, starting my very first semester, I saw this article about some guys who were incarcerated who beat Harvard in a debate. From Bard Prison Initiative, we have one of the people who was part of the debate team here, Nico Vaughn. Raise your hand. And it just clicked to me. I was like, oh wow, there's so many other folks who are formerly incarcerated who belong here. I'm not an anomaly, right? There should be more of us here, and I should do something about it. So I decided to start this organization, and I decided to take the university on to Remove the Box. And then in New York, there was a lot of stuff going on. They had just recently passed the ban the box on employment. So I decided to look at what that legislation looked like. I have no idea. I was a public policy major at Hunter, but I really hadn't had an experience writing policy or anything. But I took a look at what that was like, what the policy was. What the bill looked like, and I also looked at the work that Norris had done in California, and I started putting stuff together and asked one of my professors, hey, can you help me out with this? Is this what's supposed to be, how, was I doing it correctly? She helped me out a little bit, and I contacted one of my local representatives, my senator, who is very active in the movement as well. And I said, hey, so I wrote this thing. Can you take a look at it? Can you have someone look at it? And can we try and pass this? Because this is a barrier to folks. And they took a look at it, and the person who does his policy work was like, wait a minute, but there's something like this already. It's been submitted by another senator, and it's actually a few times been submitted. So why don't you contact her? And I had been in the work, and I had no idea that people were trying to pass this before. But the problem in New York is that we had the Independent Democratic Caucus, or whatever it is, which was 6 or 7 Democratic senators who actually were really siding with the Republicans, so they made it really difficult. So the bill never it passed Assembly, and it never passed in the Senate. And we got rid of them now. They're all gone. I think there's only one. So that's the hope, is that maybe now it'll have more traction. But I also had a lot of success, not enough as I would have liked at the university. I also tried to have the box removed at the university. I started a petition. I got almost 1,000 students to sign on. I got folks who had never been interested in criminal justice reform, who never knew anyone, rich folks in the school who were really interested in and started writing articles, and I got a lot of media attention around it, and got a lot of alumni on board. And we've been able to get 3 of the schools in the university to remove the box, but there's still 21 others. I'm trying to get the entire university to remove it. And we've also been able to get SUNY, which is the State University of New York, to remove it at the state level, but I really want to pass the legislation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, and Layla, we've talked about this, about the school level versus the state level, is, and why that's so important, is that schools can change their policies depending on who's in charge, right? So there was not always criminal history questions on college applications, right? This is something that happened after a few high-profile incidents in the late 80s, early 90s, that were not even formerly incarcerated students. It was just crimes that happened on campus, and all of a sudden, these questions were added to applications, right? So what? Yeah.
I think the Common App added it in 2006, I think it
Right,
was.
so-
And the Common App is also removing it in the 2019
Yes.
application.
Yeah.
Right.
That happened recently.
And a lot of people on this panel did the work to get the Common App to do that.
Alright.
So, yes. So it's important that we, on the state level, pass legislation instead of just changing campus policy, so that it's harder to go back, right, based on what the political will is. We're in a good moment, mostly, but we want that to be solidified in legislation versus just an admissions policy. I have a lot more questions. I'm writing my dissertation on this topic, so obviously I think about it a lot. But I do really want to save time for conversation, and so I think instead of doing all of the other questions I have, what we should do is open it up. But before we open it up, I wanted to say a couple things.
That we're also doing it at the federal level.
Yes.
So,
yes.
yeah, so
I
we're
felt
also,
like that-
we need help with
Yeah.
that. So,
Yes. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna open it up, and then at the end we'll come back for like next steps and how people can mobilize over this. So we'll save some time for that. But before we open it up, there's a computer going around with a sign-in. We're gonna send out the way to join this coalition. So this is something, it's membership-based. You can join. You can get more information, continue the conversation beyond this day. Two, while we're asking and discussing this issue and asking questions, we're going to keep everyone to the standard of humanizing language. What that means is we call folks people, not inmates, not offenders, not anything that's dehumanizing. So we're going to use people only language in this room. If you need help with that, we will help you out. So just set that up.
That's right.
I also want to do
Right.
I also just want to do a quick poll. Like, how many of you are associated with colleges that ask for criminal history questions? Raise your hand.
We don't currently,
Or
but
yeah,
our
you're
admissions
not quite
officer
sure. So
If
keep
you
them up.
don't
Keep them
know,
up.
keep your hand up.
Keep them up.
Yeah.
And then how many of you keep your hand up if you also offer higher education in prison at that same space?
Hypocrisy.
Okay. So I think that's a really important thing that in this space we should hold up, right? So I just wanted to point that out right at the beginning of our conversation. And now I want to open the floor. What questions do you have about this? Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's one of those people had to raise their hand for both.
Yeah.
On our campus, there are various elements that are very fearful of, you listed those 3 points, especially 1 and 2, the parents and the students. Do you have any resources that you have written or whatever to help me share with our admissions officer, et cetera,
Yeah,
to
so
do that?
so I can answer. So there's a lot of research that shows that crimes that are committed on campus are usually committed by people who have not been previously caught for whatever crimes they have committed. So we can share the research.
I'll talk to some of you afterwards. I'm also
Yeah.
trying to like to talk to you because I'm also trying to educate the faculty.
And you're actually the provost. You got the power to do that. Sorry, I have to call him out. I remember you're the provost.
My power's overrated, but I'll take whatever I get.
Just really quickly, we have some one-pager handouts from, we have them from Maryland, we have them from the different states that we're doing it. We also have, we didn't have a table, so I got them separated. If you want to hand them out, I was just going to kind of leave them on the table up here for folks who come up and ask questions, but you can. Information and we could pass it out electronically as well.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
All right. Let's go all the way in the back. Ruth.
I'm sorry, hold on. Someone, we can't.
I don't know if we can
You-
move these microphones.
No, they're not. No,
You're just
they're
gonna have to go out.
Really loud.
Outside
Then I
noise.
can repeat if I need to.
I'm Ruth Evans of Vera Institute. I wanted to ask, in your conversations with legislators or children and what kind of messages or stories did you find resonated with the people you're speaking to? I'm curious about that, and I'm curious about whether you felt that that was the story you really wanted to tell, or the one that worked the best to achieve the end that you wanted to.
Can I take this?
Yeah.
So I'll kick this off about what stories resonated and what stories didn't, and then I can throw it to other folks. Because what I'm doing for my dissertation is a critical policy analysis of these efforts in these 5 states. And so listening to all the conversation in 5 states about this and how that narrative is different across states, and it is different across states. In Louisiana, this was a very religious conversation.
Yes.
God believes in second chances and redemption. And if you do,
Yes.
then you should vote yes on this.
That's so awesome.
And that was very intentional. This was a very bipartisan issue. We talk about unanimous, we literally got no one voted against this in Louisiana.
Yep.
That never happened.
Right.
And people were crying. Like, it was emotional, right? But we framed it that way. And the way that we did that is we got people that looked like them. So
White folks.
yeah, we'll get to it. Don't worry. So Sarita, who's not here today because she had to be in a meeting at DC. She's on the program though. She has a very compelling story around this, and she told her story, and they were like 2-minute roll. Can you wrap it up? And we're not even listening to her. They were texting.
She's black.
Yes. they were texting. They were not paying attention. And it was really frustrating for us. The bill was not going to pass committee, and so we pulled it. And we looked for who in the state, what white woman and white man we could find had that same story. And we put that woman up there the next week, and I love her to death. She's amazing. Carla, I love you. She's probably watching on the live feed, but she's amazing and she's compelling. And she told that story, and they heard her in a way that they didn't hear Sarita, and they got it, and they saw themselves in her. That's a problem in legislative work, right? And that's a problem that we're not addressing by continuing to work the bills the way that we're working them to get them passed. And that's something that I really want, that I see in other states, and that I want us to tackle as a group, is how we can humanize people. All people, not just work around it and put the white person up on committee, right? So thank you for that, because I think that that's really, really important to put out with this issue. You have to be strategic. You have to do what works in your state. In Louisiana, religion makes policy, like it works, and we know that. And we do that, but also what are we doing to not further other conversations around race, intersectional identities, to humanize people? And then really, are we actually doing the work that we want to be doing when we're not having those conversations? Does anyone else have comments?
So I also failed to mention that I did some work with the Department of Education. I collaborated with them, and they created the Beyond the Box guidance, which asks schools of higher education to to find more holistic ways of asking the questions. And they use my story as a student's spotlight on the guidance. And the way that I got to them was just, I just approached someone from the Department of Education. She was at an event, and I just was really honest and told her what my story was, and then they decided to start this whole work around creating the guidance. That's what worked with me. I was just honest and open, and told her how I almost didn't finish the application and all of the barriers that were.
A couple of things that worked in Illinois, to get people to understand where we were coming from, was one, the sheer number of folks with records in Illinois, exposing them to that, who could possibly be affected. Many times legislators didn't know, and in our state, they tend to, especially legislators that are not from the Chicago metropolitan area, they tend to think of criminal justice issues as only impacting folks in Chicago, right? So by casting this, I mean, I think the stat, I wrote it down, upwards to 47% of people in our state have some kind of criminal conviction, right? So, or arrest. So that was an important piece. And then the other piece was some of the ideas around higher education being a major reducer of your justice involvement, right? Like, even if you look at the population of folks that are incarcerated and you look at it by education, the higher you go up in education, they're just not there, right? And even if you have some college, you don't even have to get the degree. There's some evidence to suggest that even having some college sort of removes you, puts you a few steps away from the justice involvement. So those were really persuasive.
Okay, I saw Chris is saying.
Does all of your legislation, does it apply to undergraduate programs only, but also to graduate programs?
Also graduate programs. Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Everybody
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
graduate?
So
Just across the
what I will say though, oh god, this is gonna fall. So one of the things that does need to be said though, and I think as this legislation continues to grow and gets passed, is that this one box does not end all boxes. And so,
The invisible box.
yeah, there's a lot of secondary boxes that show up. And so especially when you're looking at graduate schools, some of the stuff that I'm doing is on certification, licensure, professional organization access. We've seen a fair amount of work on this for the bar exam and some of those things. And so this is often that first entry point for both undergrad and graduate, which is good that we've seen institutions without this box still discriminate, finding other ways to do so. And there's folks at this conference that have been impacted by that. But there's many other things, especially when we look at graduate education, that there are still boxes even if you make it through that first barrier. So just another kind of piece to look towards and look, potentially include this in those conversations are the secondary boxes. This isn't an end-all be-all fix for access.
At Columbia, the work that I've done at Columbia, it's only been the grad schools that have removed the box and no recently applied and didn't have to check.
You have postdocs at your school. You should be recruiting, Noel. Okay, gentleman in the middle with the glasses. Yep.
Yes, thank you. This question is for Dr. Reese, Michael specifically. Just looking at the compelling rhetoric again, you had mentioned getting the students on board. Did you have a survey? Did you go to the student advocacy groups, student organizations? How was that done to get the students, the on-campus students on board?
So that's a great question, and I wanted to tie into the question from Chris earlier in regards to in Maryland, we set it up to where any school that receives state funding, government funding, they have to abide by these rules. So that includes private schools as well. Ours includes, Maryland's includes private and public, undergrad and grad. We really, when that veto letter came in and used this very, derogatory language and just false and, was more or less just a complete lie. And we had conversations with the governor about this, and we thought we were on page. We had backroom conversations with, leaders at institutions. So when this came up, we were kind of taken by surprise. And so we more or less, just put the manpower and the boots on the ground, as you might want to say, to contact the leaders of student organizations directly. And we had, connections already to some of those, and then we had connections to some community organizations already. So, it was just a process of contacting them. And then we did also have a survey for them. So for even the folks that we weren't able to get in front of them, we presented a package, and we could include that as well of the few questions that we asked and the few statistics that we provided them if they weren't able to fit us into their schedule somehow to come and talk about it. But most of them were willing to fit us in for a few minutes into their like general meetings that they have, either by video call or in person.
And you can use this conference and this network as an example of that. I also think, like, look for the people who have done dialogues and lectures and book series on these issues, faculty who teach Inside Out courses and work with programs. Right as this was happening, Maryland's first yearbook was Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson.
Yeah.
So a little hypocritical of our institution to be like, yeah, we care about this, but also no.
Yeah.
So use the leverage, right? Like, it's there. And I also think I called it for what it is, and I will continue to call it for what it is. The hypocrisy that institutions offer programming in prisons and then don't allow those people to attend their institutions is hypocrisy at best and white supremacy at worst.
Right.
So use that as leverage to straight up say, hey y'all, we doing this already. Might as well continue.
We happen to have
Yeah,
Brian
because
Stevenson
Columbia
coming to
does
our
that.
table, so,
Yeah,
Perfect
Yeah.
opportunity. I bet Brian Stevenson would love to have this conversation with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I love my school, Columbia University. I am extremely honored to have been, to have gotten the opportunity to go there. But Columbia does that as well. They have a lot of programs. They teach a lot inside of prisons. A lot of the professors go, and yet they're having this. A lot of the professors are from the Mailman School of Public Health, and the Mailman School won't remove the box. There's so many of the university of the other schools that they won't remove it, no matter how much I present it to them or whatever. They're just not having it.
Right in the middle.
Yeah, thank you for one. I'm inspired by all of you guys, and this is kind of a two-part question. So, for myself, I completed a 5 years after 6-year sentence, and I've been home for a year now. I just got into Cleveland State, which they had the question. I had to fill out. I had to write a paper as to why I should be accepted. So the first part, I'm going to ask, like, where should I start? Should I start by just petitioning everybody on campus, or start by working with a faculty member? And then I have a second question.
So I can start with where to start, which I feel, and because this is what, so we did it for the public colleges in Louisiana, but the private colleges still have the question. I'm getting my PhD at Tulane, they still ask the question. The students were like, we're gonna riot in the middle of the and I was like, hold on, everybody hold on. Has anybody asked them if they'll just do this? And so where we're starting is at the very top, and so we've had a couple meetings with admissions to get them on board to work out whatever kinks they think they might face for Tulane. Really interestingly, the public schools we worked with when we did the legislation, which you have to work with the schools to do the legislation closely, right? The public schools we work with, they didn't want to rescind admission from anyone. They were afraid of that as like a legal issue. Tulane is like, we rescind admission all the time. We'd like to continue to do that whenever we want. They said, okay, we're going to work on that later. But for right now, sure, that's interesting. And so as soon as I told them, like, you can continue to do that for now, they were okay. And so they're going into the meeting with us, with the president. And we've been already working kind of behind the scenes with the board and people like that to get them all on board. So that by the time we have that meeting, it's like, look at all these people that support it. We went to the campus police and got them to sign off on it. That was a huge endorsement. So I say you start at the top in like a quiet, like, how about you just do this? And then you can say that you did it, and that's going to look so good for you to have done this voluntarily, to comply with this law. They got so much positive press, right? And then, in those meetings, mention that like I also have 500 T-shirts printed and a petition with 1,000 students that's like ready to go if we need to. Which is kind of a threat, but not. But it's real, right? So I think you work both, but start at the top is what I would say.
I wanted to add something really quick. And I agree with what was just mentioned that Annie mentioned. The additional piece that adds some power to it is we did that. So we have these backroom meetings with the higher ups in the university. And one of the first people that we started with was Johns Hopkins. Hopkins is the biggest private institution in Maryland. So I was at Hopkins at the time. I'm still at Hopkins. And then also we started with the University System of Maryland. And both of them, their biggest thing was, well, the common application. If we go against asking this question or we don't use the common application, it's going to take away 99% or some crazy amount of percentage in the 90s. 90% of their applications come from the Common App. So it was a money thing for them. So if they no longer used the Common App, they were 90% of their applications, which it cost like $150 or something like that to fill out a Hopkins application. So they were losing a huge revenue stream of all the people they're rejecting because they can't even get into Hopkins, right? And they were upset about losing that revenue stream. Well, now you have the strong argument of saying the Common Application has removed this from their application. So, why aren't you being progressive? That's really the next step that, now that the Common App, which has like 800 plus schools associated with it, that they've removed it, one of the first things you can open up as you have that conversation with the higher up is that, why aren't you at this level yet?
It's extremely helpful.
The only thing I was going to add is come see us afterwards. Like we'll get you on the right. We'll get you going.
Will do. My second question is really important. I'm wondering. So when I first came home, I was at Cuyahoga County Community College, which is Cleveland's community college. Right? They don't have the question, of course, but there was a summer internship opportunity, and I told my advisor, I was like, "This is my story," and she was like, "Oh, try it. Go ahead." Turns out through networking, like it led to great stuff. But I went through the whole internship, got one, and then got a call like, "Hey, we have to rescind our offer," and they denied it because of that. And I paid good money. Their motto is "Where futures begin," and I'm like, "Where's my future at?"
So, this is my wheelhouse, and shitty. Yeah, it's a shitty moment. I would like to think that if these conversations around banning the box at the admissions level work, that it permeates through some of those other things. And so, there is this employment piece of this, and that is something that we all have kind of worked with, and that's passing at kind of a different pace and a different level. But I will say, and you heard a lot of us talk about it, right? Having a team and a coalition and a mentor and people who, when that thing happens, and unfortunately it's potentially not the only time something like that's going to happen. When that happens though, and especially if you've put money down, my hope would be that you have a group of folks on your campus, nationwide, at institutions nearby. Noel talked about that, right? People showed up. And so we can make noise. And my hope would be that you do get to join us, and please come talk to us afterwards. Please do. My hope would be that when those moments happen, if those moments happen, that we can act quickly and start to back up why that's a problem with research, with stories, with data, and shift it. And so maybe, okay, that internship doesn't work out, but we can find you 15 others real quick that will. And that's the same for honor societies. It's the same for certifications. It's the same that way. And we've worked and we have programs that do this. And so get your network, right? It's here in the room.
Yeah, I just have a quick comment about that too. I think that is an example of how, there are 48,000 collateral consequences across the United States, and in each state, each state has its own number. You can look it up. The Council of State Governments has collateral consequences inventory on the website. You can look at Ohio, and look at this. But anyway, I think what that raises, though, is that yes, we can ban the box via policy, but we have so much more work to do beyond that. I think that all of these things are intersectional. It's like the marginalization of people with rectors intersects in so many different ways. So that is where the box sort of then intersected with your career opportunities, your licensing, your employment opportunities. So we have to sort of do our best to take a holistic approach, and I think your story is an example of how we can go in that direction, because we need to eliminate sort of these licensing restrictions and these as well, right? That's something that we need to do.
Yeah, and I want to say a comment about, so Kat is emailing you right now, the membership form, and what we're hoping to build with this is a group of people that can attack policy issues related to access and education, and build collective power. So whether we're dealing with admissions or discrimination in internships or whatever or reauthorizing Pell, like we need a group of people that are trained and ready to like mobilize around those actions on the state level and on the federal level. And so that's what when you get the form in your email, that's what you're joining, right? And that's what we want to build. So I really wanted to say that. I'm looking at the time. I know a lot of people had other comments and questions. We have 10 minutes, but I want to give the panelists a chance to just shout out their next steps. Chris also, there's the formerly incarcerated college graduates network meeting today at lunch.
Wasn't it that yesterday?
There's another one.
Charles
There's another one.
leading one today.
So maybe we can kind of talk a little bit more. I'm around till Sunday, so are a lot of these folks. But I want everyone on the panel to just say like their next step of what they would tell what you can do and take from this moving forward. So let's start on this side. Stan?
So I'm gonna leave it real quick and simple and actually just borrow someone else's words. These are the words of Glenn Martin, who was the founder of an organization called Just Leadership USA, which is aimed at decarcerating America, so half by 2030. And his words that have been used a lot, in this framework is those closest to the problem are the ones that are closest to the solution, yet the ones who are furthest from resources and power to enact change. So you are the ones who are closest to the problem, so you are the ones who are also closest to the solution. So please join us and as we are gathering resources and power to enact change.
Thank you.
I concur with Stan. Please do join us. But also I have something very specific about Illinois, right? Like next week, we are going to try to get this going again. So I know they are collecting your information. However, if you would be so kind to sign your name and email, organizational affiliation, and what I'm going to do is send you on Tuesday night or Wednesday some sample tweets and some sample messaging and a target list of folks who are wavering, who we need their vote, and we're gonna sort of, we need you, and if it's coming from all over the country too, it's gonna probably overwhelm them, which is great. So I need you all to help us overwhelm them next week, and if you could just provide your information, you can help us overwhelm them.
Do you want to just send
Quincy, I'll send you that.
Send the
I
list.
got
Oh,
all here.
yes. So anyway, when I connect with you on Tuesday, because I already have your information, please just help us out and put some pressure on these folks for us, please.
spread the word.
Yes, please send it to your networks. I mean, like I said, I think that's the best way I can put it. I would like you all to. Yes, I want you to help us overwhelm them and be like, oh man, I didn't know that this was that meaningful to a lot of people across the country. It'll mean a lot to us.
Okay, mine is fill that thing out in your email. Go ahead, join us.
I'm just gonna steal Quentin's Yeah, it's the same thing. So it's not gonna happen next week, but also when we do put out that call, tweet, we share whatever, just support, ask your friends, just help us have that broader reach, and to just help stuff go viral and to spread more information about the movement and how important it is to move the box from student applications.
Noel, before you say something, I want to also say we didn't really talk about the federal level that's happening, but we'll send that out to this group. So we're working with Senator Schatz. We had a panel in the Senate about this. Senator Schatz actually snuck language into a budget bill that the Department of Education has to send out the Beyond the Box guidance. They have to track how many colleges they send it to. They have to offer technical assistance. And I said, well, what is technical assistance? And who's doing that? And they were like, oh. I was like, well, this group should do that,
Yeah.
right? Like, we should be offering technical assistance. So who do we talk to at the Department of Ed to do that? And so, like, those are the conversations we're trying to have. So there's a lot going on the federal level, too. I just want to point that out.
Yeah, and also, so, like, what Stanley said, right? The quote is also, we're furthest from the resources. So resources is also really important. We need resources to continue this work. So, if you can, whatever you can to like donate to like our different organizations or the coalition in general would be greatly appreciated as well.
Yeah, I'll be really short but sweet, and I just want to say that you may be sitting in here at a university that maybe doesn't have the question on their application, and you are very important as well. I actually, in my journey, the schools that I got into did not have the question on their application. So I had no actual personal history with the institutions that I got into with having to fill out the box. Now the schools that I didn't get into, UW, did ask the box or did have the box. So this is important at very, very important at a state level. Even if you are at a school that doesn't ask, it's super, even if you're in a state that maybe none of the schools ask. Washington State, only one school asked. So it's important in those states as well. And I would say it's even more important because that's low-hanging fruit. We can get that passed because if nobody's asking, then this should be a kind of a no-brainer that legislation like this.
Yeah.
Exactly. This would be a really good thing to do. So that's where I'll leave that. But thank you everyone for showing up. We really appreciate it.
I'll just say, it came up in conversation yesterday, but I actually had a very senior administrator at the institution ask me, well, why don't folks just lie? I was like, well, yeah, so you can, that is an option. But if that is found out, then you are often expelled to academic dishonesty. That's one answer to that question. The other answer is that you shouldn't have to. So I ask everyone in this room to take a very critical look at the applications and forms that you all have at your institutions for anything, for activities, for housing, for applications, for the things that you yourself administer, potentially. Take a very critical look at what's asked on those applications and start to make a list. And I think you will be shocked at how many lists, how many numbers on that list have the box. That is a great opportunity to start taking down that list, working step by step, piece by piece, thing by thing, to remove it. And we are all here to help and share resources. You can ask us for anything and we will find it, help it, give it. So please ask. And thank you all so incredibly much for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
I will have one last thing. Sorry.
Okay, no.
You can walk out. Continue to walk out. But one thing, so ban the box in higher education is kind of a unique situation, right? Because we can kind of gather around these social justice issues. Where ban the box in housing, you've got landlord groups, and then ban the box in employment, you've got groups that are really, really kind of solid in fighting that. But ban the box in education, because we can kind of latch onto some of these social justice issues and they're very important to people in education, it really kind of sets us apart and makes the legislation in colleges I think, I'm not going to say it's easier to do, but I'm going to say that it's much more receptive. The audience is much more receptive there as well. So we have a unique opportunity here.
All right. Thank you, Noel. Thank you all for being here. Yeah.
I've been waiting all March 15th. Come back here and be able to say, hey, tomorrow and then just my email's on there. You reach out to me. I can definitely offer you some just kind of bare bones kind of things like the first step in this is really taking a look at the legislation in other states and looking at